Thank you very much for that warm applause. I am Alan Solomont. I'm the Dean of the Jonathan Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. Welcome to this spring semester's final event of the Tisch College Distinguished Speaker Series. Tonight's conversation with Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who represents the Massachusetts 7th Congressional District, which includes part of the Tufts campus. As you can see, there's been an extraordinary level of interest in tonight's event, and we have far more people here, though I think it's thinned out, than the room could accommodate. And so I just want to make sure people leave the aisles clear and the exits clear. If you're not able to find a seat, and I think everybody has, so I won't give you instructions how to go to Breaker Hall, but we are live streaming to Breaker Hall, and if anybody wants free pizza, they can head over there, and we have directions in the back. But if you don't need free pizza, if you'd much rather see Ayanna in person, stay where you are. I want to thank all of you for being here. I especially want to thank my colleagues from Tisch College, Jess Burns in particular, for her extraordinary and their extraordinary work on tonight's forum, but on organizing all of the events that we have throughout the year. It's fitting that we wrap up this semester's Distinguished Speaker Series with Congresswoman Pressley, who is not only a role model of public service and political engagement, but for whom many Tufts students and members of this community voted and campaigned. Because I know that many of you in this room contributed to her electoral success, I hope that seeing the Congresswoman here, a sitting member of the United States House of Representatives, serves as evidence of your civic and political agency and your ability to make a difference. The idea that all young people have a role in our democracy and a responsibility to participate in civic life is at the core of Tisch College's mission. In and out of the classroom, through academic courses and experiential learning, we strive to equip all Tufts students with the skills and the knowledge they need to lead active civic lives, to tackle difficult social problems, and to strengthen our democracy. Our nationally recognized research team investigates and promotes the best ways to improve civic education and the political participation of young people. And through a variety of partnerships and initiatives, Tisch College provides avenues for Tufts students and faculty to apply their knowledge through practice and to address some of the most pressing issues of our time. We celebrate the fact that there are many pathways that lead to active civic lives, and there are many ways to create a more just and equitable world. But without a doubt, among the most important pathways are politics and public service, and that is what tonight's guest chose as the best way she could work to improve her community and our country. Ayanna Pressley is a member of the United States House of Representatives from Massachusetts 7th Congressional District. She was raised in Chicago, the only child of an activist mother who instilled in her the value of civic participation. She came to Massachusetts to study at Boston University, but she left school to take a full-time job in order to support her mom. Ayanna got her start in political life working for more than a decade as an aide, first to former Congressman Joseph Kennedy II, the father of the current Congressman Joe Kennedy III, and later for Senator John Kerry. In 2009, she became the first black woman ever elected to the Boston City Council in its more than 100-year history. While a member of the council, among many priorities, she spearheaded the establishment of the Committee on Healthy Women, Families, and Communities. She championed the introduction of a comprehensive sexual health curriculum in the Boston Public Schools. She focused on the scourge of gun violence and related trauma, and she helped the economic development of underserved communities. Last year, she challenged and defeated longtime incumbent Congressman Mike Capuano in a Democratic primary. She ran unopposed in the general election, became the first woman of color that Massachusetts has ever sent to the United States Congress. Congresswoman Pressley now serves on the House Financial Services Committee, on the Committee and on the Committee on Oversight and Reform. Perhaps more importantly, she is one of the faces of a younger, more diverse House of Representatives and Democratic Party that has the potential to reshape American politics. We are honored to have the Congresswoman with us this evening to talk about the future, about her own political journey, and about some of the most important issues facing our country. For me, it is a special delight having known Ayanna since she worked for Senator Kerry and having the privilege of calling her my friend. I'm going to kick off the conversation with a few questions, and then we have some students who will pose their questions to the Congresswoman, but please give it up for Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. First of all, I want to thank you so much for visiting us with us tonight, especially when you're recovering from a knee injury.
Yes.
I remember when we hosted you several years ago as part of a forum on women in politics, you were recovering from knee surgery.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But it's a pleasure to bring you back to campus now as a United States Congresswoman. Is my mic on? Okay. No?
He was talking about the fact that I'm Calamity Jane, and every time that I come to this campus, I'm recovering from a physical injury, and I think that's because Mercury is usually in retrograde. And so I tore my MCL, and so here we are.
I hope you're doing your physical therapy.
Yeah.
Former Secretary of State and Senator John Kerry, for whom you worked earlier in your career, recently appeared before the House Committee on Oversight and Reform to testify on the need for leadership to combat climate change. As a member of that committee, you had the unique opportunity to question your old boss, but Secretary Kerry said to you, and I quote, "Let me say how proud I am that you are here and what an extraordinary public person you are and how lucky I was and am to have had you work for me. That must have been a special moment for you."
Well, first I want to say thank you for the invitation to join you all here, and thank you all for being here in community when you could have been anywhere else in the world but here. I'm not sure I'm actually that compelling or interesting, but I will try to make your time here worthwhile. But I appreciate you all coming here, and that moment was a very full circle, serendipitous moment. You know, I remember, John Kerry, his scheduler before me had been the scheduler to Vice President Hubert Humphreys. And so after working on Senator Kerry's successful reelection campaign against Bill Weld, he offered me a position in Washington. And people said he was crazy. I had never worked in Washington. I didn't even have a degree. I didn't know the Hill. I didn't have, all these reasons, which discredited me based on conventional rules. And he took a chance on me. And it changed the trajectory of my life. And so what I said to him, he was there, it was Secretary Kerry and Secretary Hagel who were there to talk about what should be a bipartisan response to the existential threat that is climate. And I started out my line of questioning with this statement, paraphrase, that said, Secretary Kerry, you are a statesman and a diplomat and a patriot, and the country has been greatly served by your contributions, and my life has certainly been changed, and I thank you for that. And as a former scheduler and now a member of Congress, I just want to say I apologize. And he laughed because now that I am a member of Congress and literally every hour of my life is planned, I have greater sympathy for all the ways in which I tortured him and was unsympathetic. And so I think in many ways this is my own penance. But it was very full circle.
We appreciate your staff for torturing you.
Yeah. But, also I just want to say that what happened, so I serve on financial services and oversight and reform respectively. And so And this committee work has been what I have found the most rewarding part of my time in Washington in my first 100 days. Already in oversight and reform, I think our very first hearing was on reducing prescription drug pricing. We had the pharmaceutical companies in, and then had the opportunity to question Michael Cohen, and there have been so many really clarifying moments there that speak to the issues of consequence of our country right now during a very polarized time. But this moment with Secretary Kerry and Secretary Hagel, my question to Secretary Kerry was to not only speak about the connection between climate and national security, but the connection to human migration. And my colleagues across the aisle tried to strike his words from the record because they said that talking about human migration and immigration was not germane to the topic, when of course it is. When you're talking about water supply and food supply being impacted, and entire islands and communities being displaced. And we know that we have been home to many climate refugees. Just even after Hurricane Maria, some 4,000 Puerto Ricans that resettled here. And so I really just felt that moment where his credentials were questioned, whether or not he could really be an expert on the intersectionality of climate, national security, and human migration, that John Kerry could be asked that question, and then that they could say that those matters are not interconnected and not germane to the topic, and that here is someone with a pseudoscience degree championing pseudoscience legislation. And I thought it was a very sad and sobering moment, because this is an issue, like so many others, that we should not be partisan. So.
You've had a remarkable journey to political office. Could you reflect on some of the difficulties and challenges you faced, but also from where you have drawn strength?
Okay, so my biggest challenge in this last campaign, and I'm going to tell you the truth, I'm still emotionally unpacking it because I felt very hurt. I actually felt betrayed. I have been a proud Democrat since I've been in utero. And I have slept on the floor of campaign headquarters. I have, by all conventional norms and narratives, in terms of what it means to pay your dues and earn your stripes, I've done all of that, right? 16 years as an aide on the federal level, a city councilor. Boston is, 70% of Boston is in the Massachusetts 7th. This district has changed tremendously the last 20 years. It is now 53% people of color, 40% foreign born, almost 40% single female-headed households. So the district has changed, the needs have changed, and I thought, given the tenor of Washington and where we find ourselves as a country, that it needed to be about more than just how people vote, that we really needed this activist leadership, which, I'd like to think that I bring, and I'm happy to unpack at some other point really what that means to me and how I define that. But I felt very hurt and betrayed that after all of that time I've invested in the city of Boston, in our Commonwealth, and to our Democratic Party, that people could think it insolent and insubordinate even, and traitorous for me to run. Boston, 70% of it is in this district, and I was the top vote getter for 3 consecutive elections, which I hope is a testament to the work I've done, the trust and the confidence of this electorate that I earned. And I do think lived experience matters. And so I'm Black and a woman and unapologetically proud to be both. But that is not the totality. It's not the totality of my identity. I was also a caregiver to my mother. I am a wife. I am a mother. I am a survivor of a decade of childhood sexual abuse and also campus sexual assaults. So there are, my identity is conflated. My lived experience is intersectional, like most people. And so here I've done all of this, and you go from New York Times, top 14 young Dems in the country to watch, Emily's List Rising Star, and I don't know what any of these lists mean, but they meant something to somebody at some point, and suddenly all of that was out the window. And I would go into rooms, and people I've worked with in Democratic politics for decades wouldn't shake my hand, would turn their back on me, accuse me of running an identity politic campaign. And you know what I found distressing about this? Is that it was a predictable play from the GOP handbook, and the fact that Democrats and so-called progressives would lobby the charge of identity politics towards me was very hurtful. This is a charge only lobbied towards women and candidates of color. We are the only tribes in the world asked to be apologists for fighting for our very preservation and advancement. Now, I'm gonna give you an example of the power the two examples of the power of identity, okay? Katie Porter, who is a dear friend of mine, who serves on the Financial Services Committee with me, a brilliant woman and a survivor of domestic violence. She is a single mom raising 3 boys. When we had the Violence Against Women Act debate, which I can't believe we had to debate, again, a conversation for another day, she introduced an economic abuse amendment as a criteria of what is violence against women. Now, anyone who's read anything on DV knows that many victims stay in a relationship with an abuser because of economic codependence. But because that was a part of Katie Porter's lived experience, she brought that all the way to the House floor and got an amendment in adding economic abuse. That is the power of identity. If veterans can fight for veterans, if people who have battled and overcome addiction and recovery can fight for that community, if an iron worker can fight, a former iron worker can fight for workers' rights, I'm trying to understand why women can't stand in their truth and say, I'm here to fight for women, and I'm here to fight for Black folks, and especially when the data supports that we are in the bottom of every outcome. The Massachusetts 7th is the most diverse and unequal district in our delegation and arguably one of the most unequal in the country. From Cambridge to Roxbury, life expectancy drops by 30 years and median household income by $50,000. That didn't just happen in the ether. And it didn't just happen when that man descended an escalator at Trump Tower. You know, these are entrenched inequities and disparities that were created by discriminatory policies like redlining and unequal access to the GI Bill and a host of other things that I'm now trying to disrupt as a lawmaker. So my hardest moments in the campaign were when these charges of identity politics were being lobbied against me. And I felt that I had so fiercely invested in and believed in an institution and a party and party faithful who suddenly were treating me as if I was a traitor simply because I refused to ask permission to lead. And I do feel that we ran a very positive campaign. I respect my predecessor. How could you not? He was a mayor and a congressman. He has made great personal sacrifice to serve this district. I never said that I was better. I wasn't raised that way, and I don't believe that. What I said is that I'm different. And I think these times require different leadership, and the electorate will determine the rest. I'm going to go out here and make my case, and that's simply what we did. But those were some of the hardest days of the campaign. Now, on the flip side of that, when little girls write me love letters about the fact that I'm wearing my hair in a protective ethnocentric hairstyle and what that means to them, it gives me strength because I know that I am creating space for many people who have felt unseen and unheard, maybe for their whole lives, or at least for a very long time, maybe been in a fetal position since 2016. You know, and so that is really what uplifts me and what is healing some of that. And the last thing I would say, Alan, is that you were just there recently. We were in Leesburg, Virginia. The Democrats came together for Democratic retreat to sort of, you know, realign ourselves about legislative priorities and strategies and things like that. And I had the honor of introducing our former governor, Deval Patrick. And one of the things that he said in his remarks is what has happened to us, that he fears for the Democrats because we are now believing Republican talking points about who we are. And so that was some of the experience that I had in the campaign that was very hurtful.
Well, when you appeared on the cover of this New York Times photographic summary of the women of the 116th Congress, I hope you felt seen, and I know you felt you are heard.
I hope other people do. Thank you.
Young people had a lot to do with your electoral success. In their post-election analysis, the Tisch College researchers found that young voters turned out for you in a very big way. In Boston's Ward 21, Precinct 2, which is home to Boston University Student Village, turnout increased by over 400%
That's right.
from 2014, compared to the very impressive 166% increase in turnout overall. Did you target young people specifically? How were you so successful in engaging new voters and young people? And how will you continue to engage with them now that you're in Congress?
So, so let me just try to contextualize this. Okay, so if you put any stock in polling, which after 2016, no one should. But if you put any stock in polling, and I'm not trying to put pollsters out of business, but, you know, so all the polls, I mean, as recently as maybe 3 weeks out from the election, had us down by 13 points. Now, I was just head down, you know, in this. And I was not thinking about the polls. One, because I knew they could not capture the electorate we were expanding. I knew that. I knew they weren't talking to who we were engaging because of conventional wisdom and assumptions about who desires and deserves a seat at the table of democracy. Here's an example. 250 incarcerated men behind the wall of MCI Norfolk had a debate-watching party, decided to endorse our campaign, and each of them organized a minimum of 3 family members on the outside to go to the polls. That's not something you can quantify, okay? So, you know, that's not who they're engaging, right? So I knew that we were expanding the electorate, but I also knew that you couldn't poll transformation. And there was something transformational occurring, not because anything is special about me, but because people were thirsty for a shift in how we engage and how we run and win elections. And I even hate to make it about that, because when you say that, it still feels transactional. And I feel like we were engaging in something much deeper, which was not about the transaction of a vote, but about the transformational change. And although we did by default expand the electorate and extend the table of democracy, it was really about engaging new voices. That's really what it was about. And so at the end of the day, 26% of the people that voted in our primary, it was the first time they had ever voted in a primary. We grew the Latino vote by 71%. And you offer that youth data point, and that was just in one section, right? 400+%. And so here we were, less than 3 weeks out, polls had us down by 13, and we won by 17. So this was decisive. Mm-hmm. And if any of you have seen the video election night, when we won, I know people don't believe it because folks are cynical and they think everything is a performance. But 2 minutes before that organic video was taken, I actually felt very violated that it was taken by my good friend Jesse Mermel, who posted it. You know, two minutes before that was taken, I thought we lost. And I was readying myself. I had written one speech, and I said, it has to work whether I win or lose. And my team was being so tight-lipped, and they had taken all my devices away, so I couldn't refresh. I had no idea what was going on. And I thought we lost. And I said to them, listen, if we lost, you need to let me know now, because when I go out on that stage, here's what I was envisioning, that for the young people and many more, we had 14-year-olds that were knocking doors on days that it was like walking the surface of the sun, okay? 10, 12-hour days. And I was envisioning walking out into this union hall, shout out to IBEW 103, the first union to endorse me, the electrical workers, that I was gonna walk out into that union hall and look into the audience, and that light which had been turned on would be extinguished. And I was trying to ready myself for what am I gonna say that will hold that light and keep them engaged and say, we lost, but we still won. And that's literally what I thought. So I was sort of prepared because, you know, we were very unlikely. This was a disruptive campaign. I didn't expect anyone to endorse me, and I was okay with that because this is not what we do in Massachusetts. We don't primary incumbents. This is a dark blue Commonwealth. This is an even darker blue district. And so I didn't think anyone would officially be with us, but I did feel something transformationally occurring, and especially with young people who were showing up in droves. And that is why, once I was in Congress, and we were in the final throes of the H.R. 1 debate around renewing the Voting Rights Act and restoring those rights and strengthening and increasing access, I offered an amendment to lower the voting age to 16. Now, I've taken on a lot of very polarizing, controversial things. This was insane. I mean, the vitriol. People were writing, they were posting, 16-year-olds, they're eating Tide Pods. You know, what is she thinking? as if I like, and I said, well, listen, first of all, I know a lot of grown men doing that dumb crap. So let me just say that. So, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to call it, and women too, okay.
We take no offense.
But I said, first of all, this isn't mandating this 16-year-old's vote. It's making them eligible. Just like I can't mandate, although I wish I could, that anyone 18 plus vote. But you want me to tell the kids organizing from Ferguson to Parkland, who are at the fore of every existential threat to this country, from gun violence prevention to climate, that we celebrate and applaud your activism. We thank you for your sweat equity that has made things like the GND top of the agenda and now a question of every 2020 candidate. And you want me to tell them, thank you for your activism. We applaud your sweat equity, but you don't have the right to cast a ballot. The 16 and 17-year-olds I know are raising younger siblings. They are working summer and year-round jobs. They contribute to civic and community life and to our economy. So on the most base level, it's taxation without representation. Now, I do have to give it up to, as we transition, Jan Schakowsky of Illinois and Grace Ming of New York, because they proposed legislation to lower the voting age by constitutional amendment. And so that is what sparked the idea, along with the fact that this movement has been growing throughout the country to lower the voting age for city and state elections and for federal, right? And so we proposed this amendment. It did not make it into the final package of H.R. 1. However, 126, I get to say it was bipartisan, 125 Democrats and 1 Republican. Right. We're on the record supporting the lowering of the voting age, and I'm not even gonna, I won't name who it is here, but I'll just say that in an interview later, they were perplexed, because our politics are very in conflict. And he said, she just made the case, so it just goes to show that you have to, lobby everyone. And so 126 people went on the record as supporting the lowering the voting age. That is more people than have ever gone on record in supporting this. And so now, we just continue to organize.
Well, and there's a piece of legislation in the Massachusetts legislature.
That's right.
That will make it easier for cities and towns to lower the voting age in their local elections, and it's been submitted, it's I think called the Empower Act. It's been filed by Senator Harriet Chandler and Representative Vargas from Haverhill.
That's right.
Well, you took away my question because I was going to ask you about that. But you filed, you've either co-sponsored or sponsored, I think, over 115 pieces of legislation in probably a little bit more than 100 days.
And I introduced my first bill in the midst of a federal government shutdown about 12 days in.
But you've also co-sponsored a piece of legislation with your colleague, Congresswoman Catherine Clark, who also represents part of this campus.
She's incredible.
And this will deal with abuse in the workplace. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So Catherine Clark and we have a Senate, it's a bicameral bill, so Senator Patty Murray is our sponsor on the Senate side, and we've introduced legislation. It's called the Be Heard Act. We'll be doing a big rollout presser for this tomorrow, but it is the most sweeping, comprehensive piece of legislation to address workplace harassment and discrimination. Now, the reason why we offered this is because I know we have the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement, and I'm grateful for the work of those movements to elevate our consciousness, because I think, this is the moment of reckoning for a lot of things. No longer will we be complicit in harassment, discrimination, and these sort of what I really consider to be human rights violations. It's your civil right to feel safe in your body and in a workplace, and to not have power, abused in such a way. But I didn't feel that the faces of those movements was inclusive of every worker. And so this bill is not just about Hollywood. It's not just about Congress. This is about farm workers. This is about tipped workers. This is about domestic workers. Domestic workers, like, she's anonymous, and so I won't share her name, but I will lift up her story. She's a domestic worker whose employer required her to clean his home naked as so that he would have assurances that she was not stealing. And so what protections exist for that worker? Who's engaging them? Who's listening to them? And so ultimately this legislation was created, I think, in the most sound way to effectuate change and to advance policy. And that is to engage those most impacted and to actively listen to them and to be led by their stories. The best advice that I received at new member orientation was to never forget the plot. In the process of legislating and governing, it is very easy to forget the plot, and the plot is the people. And so even though we'll say the best policies are data-driven, right, and you all do research and scholarship, right, but the best data is the people. And it's about being in proximity to their hurt and their lived experiences, and only by doing that can you develop the best solutions. And so that's what we did. And so, I think this is the job of an elected official, is not only to lift up hardship, struggle, and story, and to be informed by that, what you're listening to, by that what you've learned, but also to harness the innovation and the ideas, that the two exist in symbiotic partnership. And so three things that I'll just lift up from the Be Heard Act, in addition to the fact that it is sweeping and broad and inclusive of every worker, is that it extends the statute of limitations. It lifts the cap on monetary compensation, and it eliminates NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. Those are just some of the bigger parts of it. But please stay tuned. We're doing a big rollout tomorrow.
Well, I think this university is very proud to be represented by two members of Congress that are as progressive and exercise this kind of leadership as you and Congresswoman Clark. Let's move from
great delegation.
A little bit of policy to politics. So there are a large number of newly elected Democratic House members who come from very different congressional districts and who represent a fairly broad ideological spectrum. Can you explain how Democrats in the House are going to unite around a common agenda? Do you think that the divisions in the Democratic Party that this represents pose any significant risks for 2020?
So, I think we're very celebratory about the fact that this is the biggest, most diverse, representative class in the history of Congress. And that is something that we should celebrate. But along with that, when you are bringing a diversity of lived experience, of perspective, of opinion and thought around the table, the whole value add of a more representative government means that different questions are asked and new issues are considered. Why do I know that? I experienced that myself. As the first Black woman elected to the Boston City Council, I ran on a platform to save girls that didn't even know they need saving. And the first budget cycle in the Boston City Council, every agency and department that came before me, I said, what are you doing for the girls? And they barely had a monosyllabic response. By the second budget cycle, they came with binders, multicolored, cross-tabbed, because they knew someone was going to ask the question, right? And so that is the power of having that representation around policy and decision-making tables. And so what that means is, as much as we want to celebrate the diverse social fabric and have moments of kumbaya, that there is going to be conflict. We are building new muscle. And when we learn and when we have built that muscle effectively, then we can figure out how to flex it. But it does mean that for right now, we're experiencing growing pains. And I think that people should not project their worst assumptions and scenario planning about what this will mean. The Republican Party has many factions and cohorts and groups, and you don't wonder if they're not all in alignment and in lockstep. The table of democracy is long. The Democratic Party is a big tent. If you need any demonstration of that, please look up the 20 people running for president right now. So, this is a long table. We don't have to get caught up in titles. There's room for everyone. But right now, we are experiencing growing pains. We have people in the room that are asking different questions. And I am an only child, so I didn't grow up in a big family. I have a very small family. But for my friends that have grown up in big families, they tell me that when you have a family fight, usually you're better for it on the back end. And so I'm hoping that that will be true for us as well, that we will be better and stronger for our family fights, and that that will not only lift up this unprecedented election cycle, but that with this unprecedented election cycle, we will see unprecedented legislating, unprecedented change, and a paradigm shift. And that is my concern. When the Democrats lost in 2016, we had all this post-mortem analysis. In 2018, we didn't die, so you weren't gonna do post-mortem analysis, but that doesn't mean we don't still need a checkup. We still need to do a checkup of this body politic and sort of an audit and inventory of the lessons learned in 2018. Because we did usher in a new paradigm of how elections are run and won, and so now let's usher in a new paradigm about how we govern. Let's take stock. That's why this new policy rolled out by the DCCC is incredibly worrisome to me.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Okay, so the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the DCCC, has rolled out a policy that, and it was a practice, it was sort of a whispered practice for a long time, but now it's a forward-facing policy, and that is that if you are a vendor, so let's say you do mail, all that stuff you guys get in your mailboxes you don't read. So let's say, you're.
I don't think they have mail.
They don't have mailbox. I don't even know what that is. But let's say, campaign literature or, communications or you're a pollster, right? If you are going to work with a candidate challenging an incumbent, you will be blacklisted by the DCCC. You will not be allowed to be on their preferred vendor list. Now, let me say this. I have tremendous respect for all of my colleagues. I make no assumptions of bad intention, but I do believe that there will be adverse consequences to this, both in terms of who's on the ballot, who runs and wins, and then also in terms of the opportunity for women and minority vendors and contractors and consultants. In our race, so we raised and spent 1.6. My predecessor raised and spent 6.6. Now, why did he spend that kind of money? One, he had it to spend, I didn't. But also because he went up on mainstream traditional television. We didn't do that. I made the decision to invest in Telemundo and Univision. Now, a traditional vendor around the table said, this is your death nail. This is the nail, and this is the death nail. You hear it? This is the nail in your coffin. Your district is 7% Latino, and the only media you're going to do is Telemundo and Univision? Correct. And we grew the Latino vote by 71%. Now, I was able to do that because I had disruptors around the table that said, we're not going to feel the pressure to live up to this conventional blueprint of how to run and win elections. We're doing things differently. That means we're not only going to engage super voters. That means we're going to engage everyone. And the first question we ask them is not going to be, may I have your vote? It's going to be, what are you experiencing? How has government failed you? How do we restore your faith in government? How do we redeem your relationship with government? And so if you don't create an opportunity for a diversity of vendors with a diversity of lived experience, and just to be clear, I'm trying to understand, Black women have been the most reliable voting constituency for the last 3 presidential elections. And yet, you consider me to be your biggest risk in terms of an investment or strategy. This perplexes me. And it's really in conflict with the facts of who has continued to preserve this party, in the midst of very challenging times. And so I have great concerns about this policy, and again, whether or not we are learning the lessons of 2018. If you're gonna have more diverse voices and more candidates running, you need to have consultants that also bring that are willing to run campaigns differently, so.
Well, I want to ask you a question about something that may come before the House, but not just in terms of whether you think it's a good idea politically, but how you feel your constituents are thinking about it. So as a member of the House, you may be called on to vote on articles of impeachment against Donald Trump. And there's very mixed views about whether that is a politically wise move by Democrats, but based on your passion about really listening to the lived experiences of your constituents, how do you see that issue?
Okay, well, if I talk about what I'm hearing, I think it's split. There are people that are fatigued by all of this. But I think they're fatigued by this because they're saddened by the prospect of it. This is something you have to enter into very soberingly. No one wants to relive Watergate. It was a very painful time. And I do think there are tremendous parallels that can be drawn. Our class is the biggest, but the second one that rivaled us in size and diversity were the Watergate babies. So I see many parallels that you had a class that was elected at a time of great polarization in the country that wanted to bring greater transparency and accountability and root out corruption. And so here we find ourselves again. So I think people are fatigued and weary. They're also afraid. And they also worry that if you do this, can you be focused on reducing drug pricing? Can you be focused on student debt? Can you be focused on homelessness? Can you be focused on endless wars, right? So I think, that's really what people are trying to reconcile. And what I'm saying is that we can and should do both. I think that, I support Chairman Nadler's efforts to get the unredacted full report. I do believe that Mueller should come and testify. I do believe that he is a by-the-book kind of guy. He's a constitutionalist, and he neither indicted or exonerated, and I think that's because he was sort of, leaving breadcrumbs and giving Congress, as a co-equal branch of government, the bandwidth to assume our role. And so I have signed on to a resolution that was offered by Congresswoman Tlaib and Congressman Al Green, Rashida Tlaib and Al Green, respectively. I have signed on to that. That resolution will come to the vote, a vote to the floor. I'm already signed on to that. And to initiate impeachment proceedings in the Judiciary Committee. I do believe what we have seen from the Mueller report, what is unredacted, does make the case for witness tampering, obstruction of justice, lawlessness, efforts to suppress the independent investigation in the first place. And so no one person is above the law, including the occupant of this White House. And so we can't just make this, it's like I think people feel, we don't want to set a dangerous precedent. But the lawlessness of this occupant has already done that. And to be clear, as someone who has been a proud Democrat since I was in utero, who believes in these institutions, I don't call him the occupant because I think it's cute and coy or because I disrespect the office of the presidency. I call him the occupant because he does. We went from a president who sang Amazing Grace to one who displays none. So if you had the grounds of impeachment based just on moral crimes, I could give you a very long list. Emboldening white supremacy, fear-mongering, hate-mongering, xenophobia. I could give you that. But the grounds for impeachment are not just on the loss of moral authority, which I think happened a long time ago. This is a man who ran for office and said, I could stand in the middle of the street, shoot someone, and still get elected. That's who we've elected to the highest office in the land. So I do think that, further extraction, investigation, and examination would further solidify and make this case tighter. But I do believe, based on what is unredacted, there are substantial grounds.
So I think we have some questions from some students. They're here in the second row, sitting next to Jess Burns. And so if you would just give us your name and what year you are or whatever, and ask your question to the Congresswoman.
Hi, my name's Harisa. I'm a junior at Tufts, and my question, which you've probably answered earlier, is what empowers you to insert your personal experiences into your work? Specifically, I was inspired by your speech from the Violence Against Women's Act and how you brought up your mother, and then also speaking about issues of colorism. So I'm curious.
I'm a voracious I'm a voracious reader, and people are often asking me about books for a reading list, and for some reason, whenever you get that question, you don't have an immediate answer. Because sometimes I'm reading like 3 books at one time. And a lot of those books are about policy, or I'm reading briefings or, some analysis of something. But I read a lot of poetry. I read a lot of Nikki Giovanni and Sonia Sanchez and Audre Lorde. And Audre Lorde said, when we liberate ourselves, we liberate others. And she also said that, our silence won't save us, right? And so, I'm thinking of that all the time. And when I share my lived experience, it's not to offer me up as some sort of black unicorn. Look at everything I've overcome. I'm such an anomaly. No, it's the acknowledgement that my experience is the shared experience of millions. And so when I stand in that truth, I hope that by liberating myself, I'm liberating others to stand in that truth and own that authentic space unapologetically and without shame. And that is not easy to do, especially when you often feel like just how you've arrived in the world, how you show up in the world, something you can't even control, that your very existence is the resistance. And so I hope that by sharing my experiences as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, as a survivor of campus sexual assault, being reared by a single parent, having a father who battled addiction, was incarcerated most of my life, and I do just want a point of personal privilege because the media never writes about this part. My father went on to become a professor of journalism. He attained 2 advanced degrees while he was incarcerated, came out, was a few credits short of a PhD, went on to become a professor of journalism, and now is a published author. Okay, so he made it to the other side, but he is someone who was battling substance abuse disorder, an opioid addiction, because of trauma that he experienced in his life, and he was self-medicating like millions of Americans. I remember someone online had heard a story about my dad and said, basically like, these trolls, that's a whole nother conversation, but had said, nobody cares about your junkie of a father, ruined your life. And it was an opportunity for me to say, well, there's nothing junky about my father and never was. He's like millions of Americans who self-medicated to soothe his trauma brought on by marginalization, brought on by one of the issues I lead on is that I'm working on is maternal mortality. My grandmother, my mother's father, died giving birth to his youngest brother in the 1950s. And here we are in 2019, and Black women are still 4 times more likely to die during childbirth, right? So I lift up those things in that storytelling, not to celebrate me, but so that people feel seen and heard, and to create space for others, and to know that there are people in the halls of government that are holding those experiences and being guided by them. So, but I will say that when I first disclosed that I was a survivor of campus sexual assault, not only do journalists need a lot of sensitivity training because the level of painful detail and sort of legitimizing of this that I was forced to make was devastating and really triggering, but it was also the first time I ever received hate mail. And again, I had taken on a lot of issues that made people uncomfortable, and not just for the sake of being disruptive, because I don't believe in that, but in the pursuit of progress. I was disrupting antiquated laws that had worked for people for a long time, but there were a lot of people they didn't work for. So I was used to tension. But the first time I received hate mail, where I was called a liar and a whore and attention seeking, is when I disclosed I was a survivor of campus sexual assault. But I don't regret it, because trauma doesn't discriminate. And I don't go anywhere in my travels where someone does not pull me aside. At a fancy political fundraiser, in a restroom, at a faith house, at a bus stop, and say, thank you for telling that story. That is my story too. And so in that sense, it's worth it. Yeah.
Thank you for telling us about your dad. I would never be accused of bragging on Tufts University, but we are sponsoring an associate degree program at MCI Concord, which could lead to eventually to a Tufts degree.
No, thank you, because so many of those programs have been dismantled and defunded. So thank you, and I will lift that up. So.
Hi. Oh, wow, this is loud. I'm sorry. I'm Shane Woolley.
He said this is loud.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming to our Sodden campus today. This is kind of a specific question about housing policy, which I know you had a lot of experience with on the city council, but you can broaden it if you feel like it needs it. Given the drastically rising costs of rent in the Boston area, do you support the implementation of rent control in Massachusetts cities?
I think this absolutely has got to be on the table, okay? So just bearing in mind that the reason why we don't have rent control any longer is because the voters spoke. It was the will of the voters. So that was eliminated through a ballot measure. I think right now we have to consider every single tool available to us. This is a very important debate to be happening, but I think that there are things that we should be doing right now. So one of the things that I'm exploring on the federal level is changing the AMI, the area median income, but it's something that we should be doing on the local level. So, Brookline should not be included in the area median income that developers are using as a baseline for how much affordable housing they should be building. I mean, affordable for whom? Right? So that's the first thing is I think that we should be changing the AMI. I think we need to increase the percentage of our IDP, our inclusionary development policy. I think we need to pass the Jim Brooks Stabilization Act. Activists are very fatigued. We've gone back to that well a number of times, but we need to pass that. We've made some strides, and there's one other issue that I think. Tenants' rights of first refusal. This has been very successful in other municipalities. I'm originally from Chicago, so I always want to say Chicago. Is it Chicago? No, DC. Okay, where I live now. All right, so, at least 5 days out of the week. I live here. Don't y'all start that, okay? I live in Hyde Park. I'm there every weekend, okay. But just to be clear, but tenants' rights of first refusal, which would give, a tenant, if a landlord came and said, we're going to sell, that they would have the right of first refusal. So they have the first opportunity and could even partner with nonprofits to purchase that property. And so it's been very successful in Washington, D.C., and I know there's one other municipality that escapes me right now in preventing displacement. So those are some of the things that I think we can do right now. We need to pass the Jim Brooks Stabilization Act. We should increase the IDP. What's the percentage right now? It's 13%. I think it should be at 20%. And also the real estate transfer tax. I believe they've just done this, maybe about 6 months ago in Somerville. So what it means is that if you are, if you own a property but you don't live where that property is, that the tax should be transferred so that those monies are then being dedicated towards the building of more affordable housing. So those are some of the things I think we can be doing right now.
Go ahead.
Thank you for your answer to that question. Hi, Ayanna. I'm Sarah. I'm from Chelsea, Massachusetts. So I wanted to thank you for being an advocate for MA07. I'm also a senior here. So the question that I have for you that you touched upon a little bit earlier was how to sustain and establish relationships between legislators such as yourself and activists and community organizers.
So how we're trying to model, I'm just going to say we're doing a lot of experimental things because we recognize that things have to be done differently. And so there are a lot of models that we're still testing. But baseline, and this does require more work, it requires more sweat equity and more time, is if you want to engage more voices because you want to better understand the complexity of challenges, but then also you want the solutions to be more fully informed, it does require 100 more emails, 50 more meetings, 75 more phone calls. So it requires more. So how we've been doing that is for any issue that we want to lead on or have an impact on, and that could be in the micro or in the macro or the micro, we engage the community most impacted. We don't define experts just by people that are heading nonprofit organizations or who have a comment, a title after their name that says there's an expert in this field. We go to the people who are living that experience every day. And what we do is we try to provide childcare as often as possible. We try to provide care and feeding as often as possible to be accessible to transit, because it is a misnomer. It's not true that people are apathetic. You know, what they are is busy and tired. And so there has to be a level of intentionality on those of us in government if we are sincere about wanting to engage people and to listen to them and to be led by them, that we are going to do a meeting in between second and third shift. And if you're telling me the only place that works for those second and third shift workers is a Saturday in the church basement, then that's where we're going to go. So we're trying to create safe, accessible spaces, but we're also meeting people in community. And so I'm trying to think of like a couple of examples that I could offer from when I was a city councilor that we're just still modeling. Okay, so when we saw an increase in cyclist and motor vehicle collisions, and I said, well, I mean, just anecdotally, just seems that these are just really increasing. This was about 5 years ago. So I went to the cyclist union, and then I went to cyclists, and I said, it seems like there's an uptick. You know, what can I do? And so we had 4 hearings, and we pushed for crash data reporting that then allowed us to better understand what were the hot spots, what were the vulnerable spots, because the cycling community, they all knew, they all talked to each other about where not to go, you know, where you were putting your life at risk. And so that informed for us where to make those government investments in infrastructure based on what the community told us. And then I wrote, in partnership with Mayor Walsh, the first side guard ordinance in the history of the country that is now being replicated on the federal level. And that is to put side guards on the side of trucks or city vehicles so that when there is a collision with a cyclist, they're not dragged under the vehicle. So that's an example of something that we saw a problem. We wanted to better understand why that was happening. We engaged more traditional institutions like the Cyclist Union, but then went actively after other cyclists, and then we listened. And so then we did what we could do legislatively within our toolbox, which was a hearing. We pushed for a report, and then that led to more investment. But we are way, way behind. And I should add, I do co-chair the Congressional Bike Caucus because I am very passionate about buses, bikes, and walkability. And so that's what I'm fighting for. When I think infrastructure, I think sidewalks. I don't think highways. So I want to see a greater investment in multimodal infrastructure, which is really critical to our more efficiently and with less of a carbon footprint navigating. So
I trust your rehab program involves some cycling.
okay, here's the funny thing. I mean, I don't bike because can a sister be passionate about something and not actively do it? Because of my knees, I can't go over a 90-degree, but I am still very passionate about that work.
Please.
Can you hear me now? Oh, thank you for joining us, Congresswoman Pressley. My name is Khadija Mahmoud. I'm a student here at the Fletcher School. You had mentioned this briefly earlier, but I wanted to ask you a question as a member of the new Black Maternal Health Caucus, what you're seeking to do to address racial disparities that results in adverse maternal health outcomes, not only in your district and the state, but also across the country.
Okay. Again, I think this is another example of the power of representation, right? And also an opportunity, the work that we need to do in our verbiage and how we engage people. When this was announced, so what she's referencing is, so one, this is the biggest Congressional Black Caucus in the history of Congress. It's 55 members. In the midterm 2018 elections, we onboarded 9 new members of the Congressional Black Caucus, and 5 of them are Black women. Now, this is a source of pride. For those of you that don't know, my office is the office that was Shirley Chisholm's, so I got a lot of good mojo, and she was an original co-founder of the Congressional Black Caucus when it was just 8 members. So Lauren Underwood of Illinois, the youngest Black woman ever elected to Congress, who is an RN, is a nurse, and Alma Adams, who's a representative from North Carolina, have founded within the Congressional Black Caucus this maternal health caucus, of which I'm a founding member. And that does speak to the power of representation. Now, when we launched this, a lot of people online said, what, you don't care about the maternal health of white women or anyone else? And this is the thing we're always being met with. Of course we care. You know, and that's the problem. We have this scarcity mindset. So it's not even that people are resistant to change. They're resistant to loss. And so the second you lift up someone else's story, people feel like you are muting their own. And that's just not true. Disparity is disparity. So everyone deserves access to affordable, quality, competent, culturally LGBT-oriented care, gender, right? Everyone deserves that. We can agree. That should be a right and not a privilege. But I get to tell you, yes, we all want health care, but you need to know, and we need to better understand why Black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. This is the most developed nation in the country. We should not have these kinds of statistics. And so some of the things that we're looking to push in that, so I want to be more specific. We want to expand Medicare coverage for women for 60 days. This helps against childbirth-related deaths due to depression, anxiety, and suicide after the initial 6 weeks. We want to increase the doula care providers so that they are culturally competent and offer support and resources for women throughout their pregnancy. This will reduce C-section rates, promote breastfeeding, and reduce postpartum depression. We want to reduce near-death experiences which result in chronic illnesses like heart disease and high blood pressure. And then we are partnering with folks locally that are leading in this space, like Nika Elgardo and Liz Miranda. But it all begins with culturally competent care, because what we've seen over and over again is that the medical community will delegitimize the pain and the experiences of Black women. And so that has resulted in the near death or the death of one too many women because doctors weren't listening. And so this is what we hope to prompt with this caucus. There'll be numerous pieces of legislation to come out of this. There's already one bill that existed before the caucus that was led by Robin Kelly out of Illinois called the Mamas Act. And so that's what we have going on legislatively on the federal level.
Last question.
My name is Lucas. I'm a senior here. You kind of touched on this before, but the question I have for you is, what kind of things did your field campaign do differently to engage voters, and how do you plan to continue that engagement in the next election?
Well, I'm investing in the staffing to do that, honestly. And that isn't easy because I rejected corporate PAC money in my campaign. I'm still doing that now as a member of Congress. And I know you all hear that as a very common talking point in 2020, and it's suddenly becoming the new floor. But that was the ceiling. Most members of Congress, 60 to 70% of the money that they're raising is coming from PACs that are Washington, D.C. based. But I'm making the conscious decision to, in my staffing structure and to financially invest in civic engagement. And so I have a robust team that is doing that really granular engagement, not just with retail and showing up, but in creating spaces, again, to actively listen to and to learn. And so our framework for that are equity roundtables. I know a lot of members of Congress will talk about, I've done 11 town halls and 11 weeks and that sort of thing, and I never want to give short shrift to the power of town halls, but I find it's very challenging to really have a meaningful exchange because like 2 or 3 people stand and kind of dominate the floor, and it's just hard to reach everyone. And so what we're doing are these very intimate equity roundtables, and the reason why we call them equity roundtables is because that's what I seek to achieve across every issue. I'm viewing every issue through a lens of health and equity, and how do we achieve that? And so we're moving throughout the district, having these equity roundtables. That is something we started during the campaign because I wanted to make sure that the policy priorities that I laid out and the legislative solutions were ones that I had developed with community. And so now that I'm in Congress, I get to just actualize and make real this equity agenda that we began building during the campaign, that now we just continue to add on. So we're still honoring those practices. And I'm sure there's other disruptive things that we do, but just are commonplace for us. So, so I can't lift them up as, different. But we're very keen on people feeling seen and heard, and not just in an election cycle, and enlisting them in movement building. Because ultimately, based on the cruel and short-sighted, draconian, and racist policies coming out of this administration every day, the only way you defeat that is with a movement. And that's something that we have to build and we have to sustain. If you think about the Affordable Care Act, You can give it up to Speaker and then Leader Pelosi, certainly, but ultimately, the ACA was spared not for the strategy and the conviction of lawmakers. It was saved because of the courage of citizen activists, who went and demanded that you see the humanity in them and understand that lives were at risk. And so that's the same thing we have to do. That's this activist leadership that I'm talking about, And so we have to keep movement building and sustain that. I will say the one silver lining of these times we find ourselves in is that I do believe organizing silos are breaking down. And there is this understanding that our destinies and our freedoms are tied. And so people that I see at an immigrants' rights or human rights rally, I'm now seeing at a criminal justice reform rally. I'm now seeing at a women's rights rally. You understand what I'm saying? So we have an opportunity to define for ourselves if this is our darkest hour or our finest hour. We have the prompt and the opportunity to build the most inclusive, progressive movement in history. And that's what I'm trying to do with all of you.
Thank you. Gonna let it go on. So I would just say that one of the missions of Tisch College is to try to educate our young people, our college students, to be activists. And we thank you for being here tonight and to being a teacher and a role model and a friend. But we don't want you to go away empty-handed.
Oh, swag.
Swag. So we have, let's see. I don't know what that is.
I love that. You all, I also just want to say that please do not, I know I'm not, going to be able to work this space because of my knee like I would normally, so I'm sorry for that, and be in community with you guys longer, but this is not a one-off conversation. Please do, pay attention, follow me on my platforms, find other ways to engage, and although my team hates when I say this, you can also direct message me, that's really me. Okay, so if you have questions or event opportunities, okay.
So we have a Tisch College mug, we have a Tisch College notebook, but probably most useful for tonight
All right.